The small-town courthouse was alive with the usual hum of activity, a place where people from all walks of life gathered to resolve their disputes. On this particular morning, the air felt heavier than usual, as if something significant was about to unfold. Among the crowd sat Elijah Johnson, a middle-aged black farmer with weathered hands and a quiet strength that spoke volumes. He had come to fight for his family's land, a piece of earth that had been passed down through generations, rich with memories and meaning. But today, it wasn't just the soil he was defending, it was his dignity. Elijah adjusted his worn hat nervously as he waited for his turn. His boots were dusty from years of walking across fields, and his clothes carried the faint scent of hay and hard work. The courtroom itself was modest, with wooden benches creaking under the weight of those seated and faded paint peeling off the walls. A large clock on the wall ticked loudly, adding to the tension in the room. People whispered, among themselves, some curious about the case, others merely there to pass the time. Finally, the bailiff called Elijah's name. He stood up slowly, straightening his back as he approached the front. Judge Patricia Whitmore presided over the proceedings, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Known for her stern demeanor and quick temper, she commanded respect, or at least fear, from everyone who entered her courtroom. Her reputation preceded her, and many whispered that she had little patience for those who didn't meet her standards. "State your case," Judge Whitmore said curtly, barely looking up from her papers. Her voice was cold and clipped, leaving no room for hesitation or error. Elijah cleared his throat and began speaking, his southern drawl immediately filling the space. "Your Honor," he started, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness, "I'm here today because I believe the tax assessment on my property is unfair. This land has been in my family for generations, and it means more to me than just money. If I lose it, I lose a part of who I am." But before he could continue, Judge Whitmore interrupted him with an audible sigh. She leaned forward slightly, her expression dripping with disdain. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone laced with mockery, "if you want to be taken seriously in this court, you need to speak properly. I can barely understand what you're saying." A hush fell over the room. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, unsure of how Elijah would react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances, silently questioning whether they had heard correctly. The comment stung, not just Elijah but also several spectators who knew what it was like to have their way of speaking dismissed or ridiculed. For a moment, Elijah paused. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he didn't let anger take hold. Instead, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. Years of facing adversity had taught him that staying calm often carried more power than giving in to frustration. Still, the sting of the judge's words lingered, cutting deeper than any physical wound could. It wasn't just about his accent. It was about being judged not by the content of his character but by the sound of his voice. Judge Whitmore, meanwhile, seemed unfazed by the reaction her remark had caused. She glanced down at her notes again, tapping her pen impatiently against the desk. "Well," she prompted, raising an eyebrow, "do you have anything else to say? Or should we move on?" Elijah looked around the room, meeting the eyes of a few sympathetic faces. There was Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman who lived down the road and always brought fresh pies during harvest season. And there was Tommy, the young boy who helped out on the farm after school. They were rooting for him, even if silently. With renewed determination, Elijah squared his shoulders and continued, his voice stronger now despite the earlier blow. "Your Honor," he said, choosing each word carefully, "this land isn't just dirt and crops, it's my legacy. My grandfather worked these fields when no one believed he could succeed. My father did the same, and now it's my turn. Losing it would mean losing everything we've built together as a family." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a brief second, it seemed as though even Judge Whitmore might soften. But instead, she pursed her lips and scribbled something on her notepad, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room remained thick, palpable enough to cut with a knife. Little did anyone know, however, that this interaction was far from over. What Elijah was about to reveal next would change the course of the hearing, and perhaps the lives of everyone present, in ways no one could have anticipated. Elijah's voice carried a quiet strength as he continued speaking, his words flowing like a river cutting through rock, slow but unyielding. Despite the weight of Judge Whitmore's earlier ridicule, he refused to let it break him. Instead, he stood tall, his hands clasped in front of him, knuckles slightly white from the effort of holding back emotion. The courtroom remained silent except for the occasional creak of wood or shuffle of feet. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this man would respond to such public humiliation. Judge Whitmore, still seated behind her imposing desk, leaned back in her chair with an air of impatience. She tapped her pen rhythmically, against the polished surface, each click echoing through the room like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. Her sharp eyes flickered between Elijah and the papers in front of her, though her expression gave nothing away. To anyone watching, she appeared unfazed by the tension she had created, but beneath that icy exterior there was a flicker of curiosity. Something about Elijah's calm demeanor intrigued her, even if she wouldn't admit it. As Elijah spoke, he painted a vivid picture of his life on the farm. He described waking up before dawn to tend to the animals, the smell of fresh soil after rain, and the satisfaction of seeing crops grow under his care. "This land," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion threatening to creep in, "is more than just property. It's where my family has laughed, cried, and dreamed. My grandfather bought this land when most people told him he couldn't succeed. They said a black man owning land was impossible, but he proved them wrong." His words resonated deeply, with some in the audience. Mrs. Carter dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, remembering the stories Elijah's grandfather used to tell during community gatherings. Tommy, the young boy who helped on the farm, sat upright, pride swelling in his chest as he listened to Elijah speak. Even those who didn't know Elijah personally found themselves drawn into his story, captivated by the sincerity in his voice. But Elijah wasn't just any farmer. Beneath his humble appearance lay a history far richer than anyone in the courtroom could have guessed. After finishing high school, Elijah had joined the military, driven by a desire to serve his country and make a difference. He had spent 2 grueling tours overseas, enduring hardships that left scars both visible and invisible. His service earned him honors and commendations, yet he never sought recognition for it. When he returned home, he chose to live a simple life, dedicating himself to the land his family had fought so hard to keep. The judge, however, showed no sign of softening. If anything, her irritation grew. "Mr. Johnson," she interjected sharply, "while your personal anecdotes are touching, they don't address the legal basis of your argument. I need facts, not sentimentality." Elijah paused, his jaw tightening momentarily. He knew what she was doing, trying to undermine him to make him feel small. But instead of reacting defensively, he took another deep breath and nodded respectfully. "You're right, Your Honor," he replied evenly. "Let me explain further." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded document, its edges worn from years of handling. Carefully unfolding it, he held it up for the judge to see. It was a letter from the county assessor's office, detailing the sudden increase in taxes that had pushed him to the brink of losing his farm. "This assessment doesn't match the value of my property," he explained. "Other farms in the area pay significantly less, even though their land is larger and more productive. I believe this is unfair, and I'm asking for a review." Judge Whitmore glanced at the document briefly before waving it away dismissively. "That's all well and good, Mr. Johnson, but you'll need more than a piece of paper to prove discrimination." Her tone was clipped, almost bored, as though she had already made up her mind. For a moment, Elijah hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, some filled with sympathy, others with skepticism. But then he remembered something his father once told him. "When someone tries to push you down, stand taller. Let them see your truth." With renewed resolve, he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. The edges were frayed, and the colors had dulled over time, but the image was clear enough to recognize. "This," Elijah said, holding the photo up for everyone to see, "is my grandfather, and standing next to him is me many years ago, when I first came home from serving in the military." In the picture, a younger Elijah stood proudly in his uniform, his arm around his grandfather, who wore a wide grin. Between them lay a patch of freshly plowed earth, symbolizing the bond they shared with the land. What made the photograph even more striking was the inscription written on the back. Elijah turned it over slowly, revealing neat handwriting that read, "To Elijah and his family, thank you for your courage, your service, and your unwavering commitment to our community. You inspire us all." Below the message was a signature, Charles Whitmore. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. All eyes turned to Judge Whitmore, whose face had gone pale. She stared at the photo, her lips parting slightly as if trying to form words but failing. For the first time since the hearing began, her carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing a vulnerability no one had seen before. Elijah, sensing the shift in the room, lowered the photograph and looked directly at the judge. "Your father wrote that, Judge Whitmore," he said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of sadness and understanding. "He believed in fairness and justice, just like I do. That's why I'm here today, not to fight against you, but to ask for the same fairness he stood for." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to fade into the background. Judge Whitmore sat frozen, her mind racing as she processed the connection between her late father and the man standing before her. Memories flooded back. Her father's speeches about equality, his admiration for families like the Johnsons who worked tirelessly to build better lives. How could she reconcile those memories with her own behavior today? Elijah didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, he placed the photograph gently on the edge of her desk and stepped back, his posture relaxed but resolute. He had said everything he needed to say. Now it was up to the judge to decide what came next. In that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. What had started as a tense confrontation was now tinged with anticipation and perhaps hope. Everyone present could sense that something profound was unfolding, something that went beyond the boundaries of a simple legal dispute. The courtroom was frozen in time, as if the world outside had stopped spinning and all that existed was the heavy silence inside those four walls. Judge Patricia Whitmore sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the faded photograph Elijah had placed on her desk. The inscription gleamed up at her, each word etched with a familiarity that struck deep into her core. It wasn't just the handwriting, though she recognized it instantly. It was the sentiment behind it. Her father's words were unmistakable. Warm, sincere, and filled with admiration for the very family she had just mocked. For a moment, Judge Whitmore felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what she was seeing. Charles Whitmore, her late father, a man who had spent his life advocating for fairness and equality, had once praised this farmer and his family. He had called them courageous and committed, qualities he himself valued above all else. And yet here she was, ridiculing Elijah Johnson in a way that would have made her father ashamed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out to pick up the photograph. She turned it over again, studying the image of Elijah standing proudly beside his grandfather. Both men radiated a quiet strength, their smiles genuine and unguarded. They looked happy, hopeful, qualities her father always said were essential to building a better community. As she stared at the picture, fragments of memories began flooding back. Her father sitting at the dinner table, recounting stories about the Johnsons, how they had faced discrimination but never gave up, how they had become pillars of resilience in their small town. Elijah stood quietly, watching her reaction without saying a word. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Spectators exchanged glances, some leaning forward in anticipation, others holding their breath. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and detached, seemed unusually alert, his gaze darting between the judge and the farmer. Finally, Judge Whitmore spoke, her voice softer than anyone had heard it all morning. "Mr. Johnson," she began, hesitating, briefly before continuing. "Can you confirm, is this really my father's handwriting?" Elijah nodded slowly, his expression calm but tinged with sadness. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "Your father came to visit our farm one summer. He saw how hard we worked and how much the land meant to us. He wrote that message afterward thanking us for our service, to the country and to the community." Judge Whitmore's face paled further, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. She glanced down at the photograph again, her mind racing. She remembered that summer vividly now. Her father had returned home full of praise for the Johnson family, telling her and her siblings about their dedication and integrity. He had even mentioned wanting to help them secure funding for irrigation systems, an idea he had championed, until his health declined years later. But none of that mattered now, or did it? The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had judged Elijah not based on his character or actions, but on superficial prejudices. Worse still, she had done so while claiming to uphold the values her father had instilled in her. The irony was crushing. She looked up at Elijah, her eyes searching his face for anger or resentment, but there was none. Instead, she found only dignity and patience, the same qualities her father had admired so deeply. It was as if Elijah understood her internal struggle, giving her space to grapple with it without judgment. "Tell me more," she said finally, her tone softer now, almost pleading. "About your grandfather. About everything." Elijah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He stepped closer to the bench, his movements deliberate and measured. "My grandfather," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion swirling within him, "was a man who believed in hard work and honesty. When he bought this land, people told him he was wasting his time. They said no bank would lend money to a black farmer, no matter how good his plans were. But he didn't listen. He saved every penny he earned, working odd jobs during the day and tending to the fields at night. Eventually, he proved them wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "When I joined the military, my grandfather told me something I'll never forget. He said, 'Son, the world will try to tell you you're less than you are. Don't let them. Show them your worth through your actions.' So I served my country, hoping to make him proud. And when I came home, I dedicated myself to the farm. Because it's not just land, it's a legacy." As Elijah spoke, the courtroom seemed to shrink around them. The spectators were no longer mere observers. They were participants in a shared experience, witnesses to a moment of profound connection. Some wiped away tears, moved by the raw emotion in Elijah's voice. Others sat perfectly still, afraid to break the spell. Judge Whitmore listened intently, her pen lying forgotten on the desk. For the first time, she truly heard him, not just his accent, but the depth of his story, the richness of his heritage, and the quiet determination that defined him. She realized now that mocking his accent wasn't just disrespectful. It was dismissive of everything he represented. It erased decades of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph. When Elijah finished speaking, the silence returned, heavier than before. Judge Whitmore took a long, shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as though bracing herself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I need a moment." Without waiting for a response, she stood abruptly and disappeared into her chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with whispered speculation. Had the photograph changed her mind? Would she reconsider her stance on the case? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain. The hearing had taken an unexpected turn, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Judge Patricia Whitmore retreated into her chambers, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind her. The sound seemed to echo through the room, leaving an almost tangible void in her absence. For a moment, no one moved. Elijah stood where he had been, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his expression unreadable but calm. The spectators exchanged glances, some leaning toward their neighbors to whisper theories about what might happen next, while others simply sat in stunned silence, processing the weight of what had just unfolded. Inside her chambers, Judge Whitmore sank into her chair, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shame, regret, confusion, all colliding against the rigid walls of pride she had built around herself over the years. She stared at the image of Elijah and his grandfather, her father's handwriting staring back at her like a mirror reflecting truth she had long ignored. How could she have missed this? How could she, the daughter of a man who preached fairness and equality, have acted so callously? Her thoughts drifted to her father, Charles Whitmore, a man larger than life in her memories. He had always been stern but fair, a beacon of integrity in their small town. Growing up, she remembered sitting on the porch with him as he spoke, passionately about justice, not just legal justice but moral justice. "Patricia," he would say, his voice firm yet kind, "the law is only as good as the people who enforce it. You have to see the humanity in everyone, even when it's hard." Those words had shaped her career, or so she thought. But now, faced with the reality of her actions, she wondered if she had strayed too far from the path he had set for her. She traced the inscription with her thumb, her chest tightening with each passing second. The phrase, "You inspire us all," felt like a rebuke, a reminder of how far she had fallen short of her father's ideals. And Elijah, he hadn't reacted with anger or bitterness, despite every right to do so. Instead, he had shown grace, patience, and dignity. It was as if he understood that her behavior stemmed not from malice but from ignorance, an ignorance she could no longer afford to ignore. After several minutes, Judge Whitmore took a deep breath and straightened her posture. She knew what she had to do. Pushing herself up from the chair, she smoothed her robe and stepped back into the courtroom. The chatter died down instantly as all eyes turned to her. She walked slowly to the bench, her movements deliberate, her face pale but composed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that startled even those who thought they knew her well. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone softer than anyone had ever heard it, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. A few people gasped audibly while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Apologies were rare in a place like this, especially from someone in her position. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "Earlier today, I ridiculed your accent and dismissed your testimony without truly listening. That was wrong of me, and I deeply regret it. What I did was disrespectful, not just to you, but to the values my father stood for and the principles this court is meant to uphold." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He stood quietly, his gaze steady, giving her the space to finish. The judge swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly as she went on. "When I saw that photograph and read my father's words, it reminded me of something I've forgotten. The importance of seeing people for who they are, not for how they speak or where they come from. Your family has contributed so much to this community, and I failed to recognize that. For that, I am truly sorry." The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of fabric as some wiped away tears. Mrs. Carter dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her heart swelling with both relief and admiration. Tommy, the young boy who helped on the farm, looked up at Elijah with wide-eyed wonder, as though seeing him in a new light. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, couldn't hide the flicker of respect in his expression. Elijah finally nodded, his face softening. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet strength that resonated throughout the room. There was no triumph in his tone, no hint of vindication, only a sincere acknowledgement of her apology. "We all make mistakes," he added after a pause. "What matters is what we do after we realize them." Judge Whitmore nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She glanced down at the photograph again, then back at Elijah. "Mr. Johnson, I want to assure you that your case will be reviewed thoroughly and fairly. I'll personally oversee it to ensure there are no further discrepancies. This land means everything to you and your family, and I won't let bureaucracy take it away." The crowd erupted into applause, breaking the tension that had gripped the room for so long. People clapped enthusiastically, some standing to show their support. Elijah bowed his head slightly in gratitude, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the hearing began. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about being seen, heard, and respected. As the applause subsided, Judge Whitmore raised her hand to quiet the room. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice firmer now, tinged with resolve. "This incident has made me realize that our system isn't perfect. Too often we overlook the struggles of those who have faced discrimination, not just in this courtroom, but in our laws and policies. Moving forward, I intend to advocate for reforms that address these inequities. No one should have to fight as hard as Mr. Johnson has just to keep what rightfully belongs to them." Her declaration was met with another round of applause, louder and more heartfelt this time. Spectators exchanged smiles, some nodding in agreement. It was clear that Judge Whitmore's words weren't just empty promises. They were a commitment to change, born out of humility and self-reflection. For Elijah, the moment was bittersweet. He had come to the courthouse seeking justice for his family's land, but he had also unknowingly sparked a transformation in someone else. As he looked around the room, taking in the faces of those who had supported him, he felt a deep sense of peace. His grandfather's legacy lived on, not just in the soil he tilled every day, but in the hearts of those who believed in fairness and equality. Judge Whitmore adjourned the hearing shortly afterward, promising Elijah a resolution within the week. As people filed out of the courtroom, many stopped to shake his hand or offer words of encouragement. Mrs. Carter hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt, while Tommy grinned up at him, clearly proud to know such a remarkable man. Standing outside the courthouse, Elijah took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He still had battles to fight, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Justice wasn't just a concept written in law books. It was a living, breathing force, capable of changing lives when wielded with care and compassion. And today he had witnessed its power firsthand. The days following the hearing were unlike anything Elijah Johnson had ever experienced. News of the courtroom incident spread quickly through the small town, carried by whispers at the grocery store, conversations over coffee, and even snippets on local radio shows. People who had never paid much attention to Elijah before now approached him with warm smiles and kind words. Some shared stories of their own struggles with discrimination. Others simply thanked him for standing up with such grace. It was as if his quiet dignity had ignited a spark in the community, a reminder that fairness and respect mattered more than anyone realized. Judge Patricia Whitmore kept her promise. Within a week, she personally reviewed Elijah's case, poring over documents late into the night to ensure no detail was overlooked. She consulted experts, examined similar cases, and even reached out to advocacy groups that specialized in supporting Black farmers. Her efforts weren't just about fixing one man's problem. They were about addressing systemic issues that had long plagued rural communities. For the first time in years, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, as though she was finally living up to the legacy her father had left behind. When the verdict came, it was delivered not in a formal courtroom setting but during a private meeting in Judge Whitmore's chambers. Elijah arrived dressed in his usual work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots caked with dirt from the morning's chores. He didn't expect fanfare, nor did he need it. All he wanted was justice for his family's land. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Whitmore began, gesturing for him to sit across from her desk. "After reviewing your case thoroughly, I can confirm that the tax assessment placed on your property was indeed unjustified." She slid a folder toward him, its contents neatly organized. Inside were official papers declaring the reassessment complete, along with a written acknowledgement of the errors made by the county office. "Your taxes will be adjusted accordingly, and you'll receive compensation for any additional fees incurred." Elijah exhaled deeply, relief washing over him like a cool breeze on a hot summer day. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the documents briefly before looking back at the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "This means everything to me and my family." But Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. Leaning forward slightly, she added, "There's more, Mr. Johnson. In light of this case, I've decided to push for broader reforms within our legal system. I'm working with local officials to establish a task force aimed at addressing discriminatory practices against minority landowners. We'll also create educational programs to help farmers navigate tax assessments and other bureaucratic challenges." Elijah blinked, taken aback by the scope of her plans. "That's incredible," he said after a moment, his voice tinged with awe. "You're doing all this because of what happened here?" She smiled faintly, though there was still a hint of sadness in her expression. "Let's just say I've learned a valuable lesson, one I should have learned long ago. Sometimes change begins with admitting we're wrong and taking action to make things right. You reminded me of that, Mr. Johnson. Whether you realize it or not, you've inspired many people, including myself." Her words struck a chord deep within Elijah. He thought about his grandfather, who had faced far greater obstacles without ever losing hope. He thought about his father, who had taught him the importance of perseverance and humility, and he thought about his own journey, the sacrifices he'd made, the battles he'd fought, and the victories he'd earned. Perhaps this was why he had endured, to be a catalyst for something bigger than himself. Word of Judge Whitmore's initiative spread rapidly, drawing attention not only locally but statewide. Newspapers ran headlines praising her bold steps toward reform, while community leaders commended her willingness to confront past mistakes. At first, some skeptics questioned whether her actions were genuine or merely an attempt to salvage her reputation. But as tangible changes began to take shape, new policies implemented, workshops held, and resources made available, it became clear that her commitment was real. For Elijah, life returned to its familiar rhythm. He spent his days tending to the fields, repairing fences, and caring for the animals that depended on him. Yet there was a newfound lightness in his step, a sense that the weight he'd been carrying for so long had finally lifted. Neighbors stopped by more often, offering help or simply sharing a laugh over a cup of coffee. Even Tommy, the young boy who helped on the farm, seemed prouder than ever to be part of something meaningful. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden rays across the landscape, Elijah stood at the edge of his property. The soil beneath his feet felt alive, pulsing with history and possibility. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the farm wash over him. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the gentle hum of insects. This land wasn't just earth. It was a testament to resilience, a symbol of hope. Behind him, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Turning, he saw Judge Whitmore approaching, her figure silhouetted against the fading sunlight. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, which she extended toward him with a shy smile. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, her tone hesitant but warm. "I wanted to see the land your family has worked so hard to protect." Elijah accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, stepping aside to let her pass. "It's always open to those who appreciate it." Together, they walked along the rows of crops, the judge asking questions about the farming process and listening intently as Elijah explained. There was an ease between them now, a mutual respect that transcended their earlier encounter. As they reached the spot where Elijah's grandfather had once stood, Judge Whitmore paused, her gaze lingering on the horizon. "Your family has done something remarkable here," she said softly. "They've built something lasting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who believes in justice and fairness." Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "We didn't do it alone," he said. "People like your father helped pave the way. And now, with folks like you stepping up, maybe the road ahead will be smoother for the next generation." As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, the two stood side by side, united by a shared vision of a better future. In that moment, it was clear that redemption wasn't just possible. It was powerful. It could mend broken relationships, challenge outdated systems, and inspire others to follow suit. For Elijah and Judge Whitmore, this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something transformative, a ripple effect that would continue to grow long after the sun had set. The weeks that followed brought a quiet transformation to the small town. The ripple effects of Elijah Johnson's courtroom victory and Judge Patricia Whitmore's subsequent reforms began to shape not just individual lives, but the community as a whole. Conversations that had once been avoided about race, inequality, and systemic injustice were now happening openly. People gathered at church potlucks, town hall meetings, and local cafes to discuss how they could contribute to making their corner of the world fairer and more inclusive. Change was slow, as it often is, but there was no denying the momentum building behind it. For Elijah, life on the farm settled into its usual rhythm, though it felt richer somehow. With the tax issue resolved, he no longer worried about losing the land that meant so much to him. Instead, he focused on nurturing it, pouring his energy into planting new crops and repairing old fences. Yet something else blossomed alongside the fields, a sense of purpose beyond himself. He became a figure of inspiration in the community, someone people turned to for advice or encouragement when facing their own struggles. One Saturday morning, as Elijah worked under the shade of an oak tree near the edge of his property, Mrs. Carter pulled up in her weathered pickup truck, a basket of freshly baked pies balanced precariously on the passenger seat. She hopped out with surprising agility for someone her age, beaming as she approached him. "Elijah," she called out, waving enthusiastically, "I've got something for you." He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Carter, you didn't have to bring anything," he said, though his eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Nonsense," she replied, handing him the basket. "You've done so much for all of us, even if you don't realize it. These pies are my way of saying thank you." Her voice softened as she added, "And not just from me, from everyone who cares about this town." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "All I did was stand up for what was right," he said humbly. "It's folks like you who keep reminding me why it matters." Mrs. Carter patted his arm affectionately before climbing back into her truck. As she drove away, Elijah glanced down at the pies, each one wrapped neatly in checkered cloth. They weren't just desserts. They were symbols of connection, reminders that his fight hadn't been in vain. Meanwhile, Judge Whitmore continued her efforts to reform the system. She organized workshops aimed at educating farmers about property rights and tax laws, ensuring they wouldn't fall victim to similar injustices in the future. She also partnered with advocacy groups to create a hotline where individuals could report discriminatory practices anonymously. To many, these initiatives seemed like small steps, but Elijah knew better. Every action, no matter how modest, planted seeds for lasting change. One evening, Elijah received an invitation to speak at a statewide agricultural conference. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for such a platform. But, after some encouragement from Mrs. Carter and Tommy, he agreed. Standing before a room filled with farmers, policymakers, and activists, he shared his story, not just the hardships he'd faced, but the lessons he'd learned along the way. "Justice isn't just about winning battles," he told the audience, his voice steady and heartfelt. "It's about building bridges, seeing each other as human beings, and working together to make things better for everyone." His words resonated deeply, earning a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. When he returned home, letters and messages poured in from people across the state, thanking him for giving them hope. Some wrote about their own struggles with discrimination. Others expressed admiration for his courage and resilience. It was overwhelming at times, but Elijah welcomed it. If sharing his story could help even one person feel less alone, he considered it worthwhile. Back at the courthouse, Judge Whitmore found herself reflecting on her journey. She had started as someone rigid and unyielding, clinging to outdated notions of authority. Now she saw herself differently, as a servant of justice, tasked with ensuring fairness for all. Her relationship with Elijah evolved too. Though their paths rarely crossed outside formal settings, they occasionally exchanged letters or met briefly during community events. Each interaction reinforced her belief that true growth came from listening, learning, and adapting. One crisp, autumn afternoon, Elijah decided to visit the cemetery where his grandfather and father were buried. Carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, he knelt beside their graves, brushing away fallen leaves. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The land is safe, and we're making a difference. You'd be proud." As he stood up, he noticed Judge Whitmore standing a short distance away, watching respectfully. She held a single rose in her hand, which she placed gently on the ground near the headstones. "Your family has taught me so much," she said softly, "about strength, dignity, and the power of forgiveness. Thank you for letting me be part of your story." Elijah nodded, his eyes glistening. "It takes two to build a bridge," he replied, "and you've done more than most would have." They walked back to the car together, the golden sunlight casting long shadows across the landscape. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with mutual understanding and respect. In that moment, it was clear that their lives had intertwined in ways neither could have predicted, creating something beautiful out of pain and misunderstanding. Years later, when Elijah looked back on those days, he realized how much had changed. Not just for him, but for the entire community. His farm thrived, supported by neighbors who valued its history and significance. Young people like Tommy grew up learning about the importance of standing up for what was right, inspired by stories of resilience and redemption. And Judge Whitmore's reforms continued to make waves, influencing policies far beyond their small town. What started as a single act of ridicule in a courtroom had transformed into a legacy of hope and unity. Elijah often thought about that day, not with bitterness but with gratitude. It had reminded him of something his grandfather used to say. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories. For Elijah, Judge Whitmore, and everyone touched by their story, those words rang truer than ever. In the end, it wasn't just about saving a piece of land. It was about proving that compassion, humility, and perseverance could heal wounds, bridge divides, and create a brighter future for generations to come.